terms of how to. Awesome. Um, that's bumped me out my presentation. I'm assuming you can see it now. We're just going to walk through do a couple of activities. From what I can gauge, people have debated before, but not many people have done British parliamentary debate, so this will be quite topical. Firstly, then, what is British parliamentary debate and what is unique about it? For the majority of you that have debated before, obviously you know that there's a side that proposes a motion and a side that opposes a motion. What's unique and quite nice about British parliamentary debate is that you have these, but you also have a closing half, which is intended to create nuance to the discussions or create a level of depth to the kind of arguments that you're making. So it's not just the case that you can win debates from making like many different arguments. There's a higher barrier to entry in terms of the extent to which you analyze particular arguments and the ability to make impacts out of them as well. So you have 8 positions in British parliamentary debate in chronological order: the Prime Minister, the Leader of Opposition, the Deputy Prime Minister, and the Deputy Leader of Opposition. And this is top half. So you have opening government, which is the first team to propose the motion, and opening opposition, which is the first team to oppose a motion. And then you have the back half of the debate, which is closing government, the second team to propose the motion, and closing opposition, which is the second team to oppose the motion, which consists of the member of government, the member of opposition, the government whip, and the opposition whip. These fancy schmancy little names don't mean anything. They're just to refer to areas in the British Parliament as it is modelling that in and of itself. Cool. What is a prime minister? What is a leader of opposition? These are the first speakers of the first teams to propose and oppose a motion. Given that they're doing this, they have a duty to frame, contextualize, and model the debate as needed. So oftentimes in debates, you can't just make an argument with no context or without telling your judge what kind of world your debate exists in, if that makes sense. Oftentimes we have debates to solve a particular problem in society. I'm going to let IDL Kamal deal with that comment. Oftentimes in society, you have like a problem and a debate is trying to argue whether one solution is particularly good to a problem or not. This is the time in which you contextualize what the problem is, specific definitions in the motions, in specific key terms as needed and as helpful to your side of the debate. I think this is a more arbitrary point, but you should really be running 1 to 3 arguments of substantive matter during your speech. The caveat here is that you should absolutely prioritize quality over quantity. So you should be running good arguments as opposed to running a lot of arguments, as I talked about before in terms of the uniqueness of British parliamentary debate. I generally think you can win debates from running 1 insanely good argument or 3 really good arguments. It just depends on how convincing you are to the judge in explaining why these arguments are winning. The Prime Minister is the first person to speak in the debate. So obviously they can't respond to anything said in the debate, but they can give preemptive responses to things said in the debate. It is specifically the duty of the Leader of Opposition to respond to either the characterization of the motion given by the Prime Minister or to give independent responses to the arguments brought forward. So rebuttal, basically. Both speakers should be taking a POI from their respective diagonal for engagement. So if I go back to this, So for example, if you are opening government, then you should be taking a POI from closing opposition, who is diagonal on that graph earlier. And if you are opening opposition, so leader of opposition, you should be taking a POI from closing government, as is your diagonal. I think what's important to note about these speeches, specific to other speeches, is you are setting the tone for the debate and for the rest of the round. So I think it's about being very persuasive in a specific way to which the motion demands. So if it is we'll get onto what POIs mean in a second, Mahit, but I think specific to these kind of speeches, you are like, I think it's good to be like necessarily passionate and serious when needed. For example, if you are doing a politics or an international relations motion, or like a serious religion motion or stuff, and witty and lighthearted where appropriate. So like a fun narrative in terms of media motions and all this kind of stuff. Use short and clear statements to structure your speech. What is the structure of these? So the structure of the first speeches in British parliamentary are quite simple. You start with defining the debate, so framing and characterization. It's good not to spend enough time on this, but it's good to give it its dignity so that everyone in the debate understands what context your argument exists in and what context the debate should exist in. And then you make your arguments, and then I've done a very detailed headline of what the structure of these particularly looks like. So you start with the headline, and then you give a premise. So basically explaining what your intention is behind this argument, what the underlying assumption of this argument is. And then you give reasons why the premise is true. And then you give impacts that result from this analysis and what the implication of your argument is in the first place. I'll get on to weighing first, but I just want to make this very clear. I'm going to walk this through with a pretty stock motion to try and illustrate what I'm doing, and then I'll take questions if anyone has them. Cool. So an example motion we'll use for this house would ban zoos. So that's this house would ban zoos. And so an argument that open government would make, for example, is that this is really good to protect animals. The premise is just contextualizing why it is the case that animals are particularly endangered or damaged, like at vulnerable situations in zoos, and explaining why it is immoral to put these in these situations. So that would be a premise, that animals are necessarily it's immoral to imprison them and take them out of their natural habitat, and it is bad that we are doing this in society. And then you give reasons why this is true. Specific things like, for example, if you're a polar bear, then obviously if you live in London Zoo, you're being taken out of your naturally cold habitat and living in the London Zoo. And animals can't consent to this, so this is immoral. Or like a second reason, for example, for this would be that, like, for example, it is bad specifically because they don't get to socialize and engage with their habitat in a normal way. It would be bad, for example, if we put humans in prison for no reason for other people to watch and laugh at and be entertained by. So it's bad that we don't do this to animals. So these are like a couple of reasons why it's true that animals are kept in bad conditions and why it is immoral to do so. And then you just have to ask yourself here, why is this important? And this comes on to impacting. But before I do that, are there any questions specifically about analysis or specifically about what it means to ask why a particular claim is true? Feel free to shout out or feel free to type in chat. Cool. I'm going to assume then that that is fine. Goodness. Okay. If you have them at the end, let me know, but we're going to do an exercise for this anyways. On to impacting then. So now that you've been able to explain that it is bad to take animals out of their natural habitat, and it is bad to look at animals and laugh and make fun of them because they didn't consent to it, now you need to explain what the impact of this is. Particular impacts for this, like, for example, would look like things like the idea that they develop really inhumane behaviors, for example, or they aren't able to survive in the natural world. So, for example, if you are like a, I don't know, like a seal, for example, in like a aquarium, it is really bad because you aren't able to develop the natural behaviors that you need to, for example, survive in the wild. Or you won't necessarily have a good quality of life because you are kept in a very small box and you are fed very little. It is similar to being in prison. So that's the impact of this, which is just that these animals have a terrible quality of life as a result of being kept in these conditions, and you do this to a lot of animals. Another fun impact could be just the perception that humans have of animals as lower than them. If it is normalized in society to just laugh at animals and like make fun of them and only look at them for the sole purpose of enjoyment, this creates other narratives in society about how important we should value animals' lives. So this leads to, for example, like, I don't know, animal testing or even a normalized culture of eating meat because we simply don't value the quality of animals' lives. So that's the impact side of it. So that's the crux of your argument done. And that in and of itself would be enough to win in other styles of debate, maybe. But specific to British parliamentary, and given the fact that you don't know what teams later in the debate are going to run, it's very important to weigh. It's very important to explain why this is more true and more important than other arguments made and will be made in the debate. So, for example, opposition can very validly claim that it is good for kids to go to zoos because they get educated, and it's probably really fun to do so because the animals are like it's animals you don't get to see usually because you can't afford to travel to Antarctica or Africa or these kind of things. The weighing here would be that it is good to get education, it is good to get enjoyment, but there are other ways of doing so that don't harm animals. Therefore, we should care about animals and like the ability of them to have a good life more than the enjoyment of humans. So that would be the weighing. I've made an arbitrary note of like roughly how long you should delegate to these kind of speeches. If it is 5 minutes, take like, I don't know, 45 seconds to frame and then do like two good arguments, which are like 2 minutes long. This is very arbitrary, by the way. And if it's 7 minutes, just generally take about 2.5 minutes to get all of these things done and get to the crux of what you're saying. I think this is very important, so I'm going to leave this here. But does that largely make sense for the most part? Feel free to shout out if it doesn't. Aditi Rajan asked, what distinguishes the quality of individuals in terms of their contributions to a group in debate? That's a great question. So I think different judges have a different opinion on this, but I think generally speaking, I think debates are one on how you engage with teams specific to British parliamentary. And I also think the debates are one in terms of how you are able to compare your argument to other people's arguments. So it's partly about taking down other people's arguments, but it's also explaining why the flaws in their argument are sufficiently filled by your flaws, largely speaking. Yes, Tanuj?
Is weighing something that you would like prioritize doing a PM speech, or is something that you would give it to your DPM or your DLO?
I think it completely depends. I think that um I think that it is probably really good to have in a prime minister's speech, specifically on things like this, where you have a pretty good impact for humans and a pretty good impact for animals, just to make sure and establish the comparison you're making in the debate. Um, you obviously do still do weighing in DPM and DLO when you have a better conception of what your closing teams are going to run. But I do just think that you should be doing this in both. And I think the weighing specifically looks different for PM and DPM, if that makes sense in the first place, which is what I'll come on to now. Does that largely answer your question? Um,
Uh, yes. Thank you.
oh, shit. Sorry. Um, On to deputy speeches then. So you've had the Prime Minister and the LO. So those are the first two speakers. Now on to the second speakers of the proposition opposition on top half. I truly believe, and I think that many judges credit the fact that deputy speeches exist to respond comprehensively to the previous speaker and to rebuild your partner speech from the attacks brought upon explicitly or implicitly by the opposing team. So when I keep hammering on about rebuttal, it is good to listen to the rebuttal another team has brought and explain why it doesn't work, and also provide your own rebuttal to the team and explain why their arguments are like not beating yours in very simple terms. Um, we'll go through this in the exercise as to specifically what this looks like, but I think the way to do this is just through firstly structure, and secondly just taking the time to think about the ways in which both cases engage. So, for example, I do think that opposition also has a valid line here in terms of the sanctity of animals, which is to say, there are some animals in society that would really struggle to be in the wild, but either because they have a lower population or the conditions are really extreme, and you are able to take them out of that and put them in a controlled environment so that the species can thrive. That's what opposition can say in terms of doing good for animals. What you then do from DPM with the argument we talked about earlier is to go, yes, in the best case, this impacts a few animals. We impact a lot. But it's also just secondly saying and giving independent reasons why actually this claim isn't true. So, for example, just the case that, like, if it is polar bears and you're taking them to London, obviously London is substantially warmer. The oxygen levels are substantially different and the environment is so bad that you probably just evolve the endangered species in a particularly negative way. And then there's also just some fun stuff if you do the research on like genetic diversity there. And these would be examples of explaining why the other side's argument isn't true and your side's argument is probably more true for more animals, which is direct rebuttal and weighing here. DPM and DLO speeches should also be taking a POI from the diagonals I talked about earlier. So if you're opening government, then you're taking a POI from closing opposition. If you're opening opposition, you're taking one from closing government. And do a brief justification of why their impacts are the most important in the debate and preempt cases coming from closing teams. Preempt is basically just a posh way of saying, I've heard your POI. I'm going to try and predict your case based off of that and explain why ours would still be winning and push a burden on you to do X, Y, Z things in order for you to win. So, for example, if I was opening government and then closing opposition POI'd me, for example, to say, this is like, presumably it is better to make humans care about animals so we get more funding towards animals, for example, then you would say, yes, maybe, but you have to prove that this is the only way you can get the humans to care about and be proximate to animals. That would be an example of pushing a burden for a team to preemptively show why their argument is lesser than yours. And then obviously when they run the argument and you have stuff you disagree with, you'd make a point of information in the first place. I do promise we're coming on to it. It's the very last slide for specific reasons. However, having said that, deputies can run and make new arguments, although you should deprioritize these compared to effective engagement with the previous team. The caveat here, though, and the exception to this rule generally, is if it is the case that, I don't know, you've realized you've misread the motion, for example, or you think there's something really important in the rebuttal that your previous speaker, like the previous speaker in the debate has mentioned, that is the point at which you can run a lot of new analysis or a new argument to effectively take down that point. Sometimes it isn't just individual lines that take down a point, but necessarily a whole argument to do so. And quick note on style here, you are the last impression a judge will have of your team's speaking ability. So make sure you end strongly and make sure you just end with the most persuasive parts of your case the judge should care about. Cool. That is the top half done and the top half structure. Does anyone have any questions before we move on to the activity? Oh, I'm going to assume that's a no. We'll get started with this activity and then we will get some responses back. So, quickly on structure. Sorry. So we talked about the PMLO structure, which was just framing, arguments, weighing. This is actually really important and often very overlooked in deputies, because I think previous norms would just respond line by line and just hope for the best. I don't think that particularly works because oftentimes you miss the premise of an argument, i.e. the intention behind it. And then, for example, if you're deputy prime minister, then the DLO can come and say, actually, that's not what we meant, or give independent reasons, and then you're ultimately beaten out. So this is how you should broadly be prioritizing and responding to teams. And this is also true for whips. So you just give a line summarizing the argument. Notice that there's a difference between responding to the headline of an argument and responding to the premise of an argument. The premise is the thing you want to attack, because if you attack the assumption behind an argument, then it is easier to take the argument down than just the headline, where they can just provide another set of reasons, for example. The first thing you do is what I like to call burden pushing, because I think this is the easiest. What do they need to prove to make this argument true? So, for example, if the opening opposition case is that it is good because humans get to have fun with animals, they get to engage and be educated on specific animals that they wouldn't do otherwise, you burden push and split the first headline of this is, you would say, it's unclear why they can't do this in other ways, like reading books, watching TikToks, going on the internet. Or you would say, they need to explain why zoos are particularly good at doing this well. So why is it the case that you're able to get a diverse array of animals in the kind of zoos that the average person sees? Because maybe it is true that the London Zoo and the zoos in the big cities in the world have a diverse range of animals, but it's not certain that you will have these in the kind of local zoos, if that makes sense. So you just point out what is unclear or unproven in that argument in the first instance of response. The second level of response, then, so you don't look like a hypocrite, is to explain what your partner already explained on the kind of things you do. So, for example, if the pushback here is that it's unclear where this applies, you would say, my partner's analysis on animals being harmed applies universally because animals, like the quality of life of animals is harmed and like diminished irregardless of what kind of animal it is and what kind of zoo it is. So that's what you do. So you compare the negative pushback you're giving to the positive material of your partner. Or if your partner doesn't do it, this is a good place to give your own reasons why your own side is able to prove these things in a good way. And I think this is probably the most important because this is the way in which we're able to make debates comparative and engaging, as I talked about. Because it's all well and good that all eight speakers in the debate go, your argument was terrible. Here's reasons why your argument was terrible. But if you can't back that up with your own side and what you already explained, it is hard for judges to make that particular distinction in the first place. And I think this just makes it very clear in the judges' minds why it is the case that your argument is beating them. The third thing is ideal, but I appreciate it doesn't happen in every instance, which is to say, why is what they are saying actually untrue? So, for example, if you want to flip the stuff on humans, for example, you can say, it is actually quite scary to go look at a tiger for a kid, specifically because tigers roar and tigers have really sharp teeth. And if you see, for example, two like tigers fighting, that's a very intimidating experience that might be the reason that kids, I don't know, like opt out or actively are scared of animals for like a good proportion of their childhood. So it's probably better than they see this in books and see this on videos online if they want to, as opposed to in person where they might feel like their life is threatened because they are kids. So that's flipping the reasons the previous speaker has given on these particular things. So that's rebuttal. And then you do that for however many arguments you have and how whatever characterizations and framings they do for the debate as well. And then you go on to rebuilding the cases. So this is where you talk about the responses that have been given to your case and ideally arguing why they're not enough. But I appreciate that sometimes there are really, really good responses to your case. This is where you either run new substantive and new arguments, or you just do a lot of weighing. How do you rebuild a case? You say, this is what my partner explains. This is the premise behind the case. This is how the other team attacked the premise. However, these attacks are insufficient because X, Y, Z reasons. Like, for example, doesn't respond to the nuances of our cases, doesn't they don't understand the intention of the premise, or actually just calling out scammy responses if they do exist. And this comes down to the second one of why is this insufficient to take down the argument? I think an important thing to do here and an important piece of advice for insufficiency is just to say, even if you buy these responses, here's why our argument still works. So here's reasons why our argument still works. So for example, for the animals are treated terribly in zoos, you can say, even if it is true that the richest zoos in the world probably take real good care of their animals because they have the incentive to, this is the point at which you say a lot of zoos can't do this, and a lot of institutions similar to zoos take note from this and therefore don't do this. So we are able to get a bigger impact on animals being harmed. So that is the extent to which you rebuild a case. It can also just be adding more analysis, adding more impacting, and adding more like ways to make your case persuasive, if that makes sense. I'll talk about weighing, and I think someone muffled or something, which must mean like a question or something. This is when you weigh the case's contribution to the debate. And I guess this answers the question asked previously in a new way. So while Prime Minister and Leader of Oppositions weigh the case in and of itself and why it's important, DPM and DLO, given the fact that they now have information on what the teams are likely to run, can now weigh this compared to what they think their closing is going to run and what opening opposition has run in the first place. And I think this is just an added layer of, just in case you don't believe anything I'm saying, here's why what my first speaker said should win the debate. And this is where you talk about metrics, specifically like who gets the best for animals, who gets the best education, who gets the most funding. These are the kind of metrics you do in the first place. Are there any questions on structure? Cool. I think we're doing very good for time. I'm happy. Lovely. Your turn. So let's say the motion is this House believes that the rise of social media has done more harm than good. We're just going to talk through what questions you have to think about when you first see this motion, which are listed there, and ultimately just come up with some arguments for opening government. So take 2 minutes until 1:30, and then I'll come back to you. Cool. Cool. Awesome. We're just going to spend like 5 minutes on this, or maybe even 10, and just walk through the questions. So just feel free to unmute yourself and shout out. But we're just going to ask the first 3 questions. What do we think we need to define within this motion? What do we think we need to contextualize, frame, and characterize from opening government? Anyone?
If I may,
Yeah, go for it, Mahit.
so ultimately, if you're talking about social media, right, we'll have to first of all contextualize what is meant by social media. Social media can be used as a huge blanket term. So if we're beginning from sort of we're opening for government, right? So then in that case, we'll have to sort of restrict that to a specific sort of social media, which is the most prevalent, so that then we can build up from that.
Yes, excellent. Yeah, Niyati?
Okay, so obviously we need to define what social media is. Then we'll have to define stakeholders and how it affects different peoples from different age groups. And we'll have to talk about a particular age group because I don't think we can encompass all age groups in one speech. So maybe we can divide and like speak between 2 speakers.
Yeah, excellent. Anyone else?
Yeah, I want to say.
Yeah, go for it.
Actually, the previous one also told, so we need to explain that social media is not just a part of entertainment, but is also a part of business that people do.
Yeah, awesome. So it's explaining where social media operates and who it operates for. I also think there's 2 things which are really important that are specific to the wording of this motion as well. Sorry, 1 second. So 2 things that are quite important here is the word the rise. So it's explaining what the rise looks like, where it started, all of these kind of things. So immediately to your mind should be coming things like the rise of the phone, the rise of apps like TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, these kind of things. And then the second thing to think about is more harm than good. So it's recognizing that obviously you are able to connect with friends and stuff. And then it's going further and explaining why the harm, i.e., for example, mental health, addiction, and these stuff outweigh this. And these are things you should establish at the top of contextualization. I think the second thing is something that debaters often skip, which I think is really important, specific in terms of strategy, because it sounds like you all have good ideas. The question is how you think the debate is going to play out, which comes with experience. So what are the most important impacts in the debate, and what do I have to prove to win from opening government? I'll take someone that didn't get to speak last time. But yeah, sure, I'll take Niyati.
Okay, so first of all we'll have to consider the impact of how social media has risen, and we'll also have to think about the more harm than good part. So we'll have to mention maybe some examples on how social media affects people's mental health, and maybe about how it spreads fake rumors and news.
Yeah, I agree. So mental health is an impact. Yeah, Mihit.
Hello. Yeah, yes. So, moving forward from mental health as well, I would like to say that social media, one of the more negative impacts of social media that can be seen are also the incentivization of harmful content, because there is no sort of filter, right? The filters are very easily bypassed, in
Yeah.
which basically people, if people consume depressing content, they will be recommended more depressing content. So inherent patterns in the structure, the way social media is developed, are also important to be recognized.
Yeah, I agree. It's the case that if we have free speech, then good people can post and bad people can post, and you can post positive and negative things. So the question then being, is this information good? Is this information true? I'll call upon Aditi because I don't think we've heard from them.
Yeah, I mean to say that people on social media just reflect some part of their life, and that actually eventually put people into stress that they are not doing very well with their life. So it's like not that content that we see on social media is very much filtered.
Yeah, of course. I'll take from Kashni and Tanuj on the last question, but I want to end this question by just saying we've covered the broad questions. So it's access to information, how people react to it, and then like specific impacts in terms of what was just it's previously talked about. Cool. Lastly, what would you run from opening government? Let's go to Kashni first.
I think one of the main arguments health. Even I don't realize like I can spend hours scrolling and it would really put a negative impact.
Yeah, I completely agree. So it's the idea of necessarily being addicted to your phone and getting so much validation out of it that you keep wanting to do it. And this ties in really nicely to the algorithm analysis that Mihit gave earlier. Yeah, I'll go to Yehil and then Tanuj and then we'll move on.
Just to clarify, we're talking about arguments we run from opposite government, right? For this particular question.
Yeah, for opening government, yes.
Opening government, yeah. So sorry. So we could also perhaps talk about the fact that social media is also opening more chances for hate speech. We could talk about the fact that social media has provided a space for more violent rhetoric to brew. So while social organization is able to happen, oftentimes it's not the most productive kind. We could talk about misinformation and how this has significantly impacted the ability of governments to reach out to people and have effective information. So I suppose that.
Yeah, of course. I'm just going to push you on this, EAO, just for the interest of specific to the debate. Why do you think the rise has caused this?
So we see that, I mean, I would use an example, right? So during the pandemic, we saw that more and more people got online. As we saw more people get online, the pandemic was one of those key incidents that I suppose illustrate this example or illustrate the point I'm trying to make, where more people getting online also meant that more people were able to express themselves online. While doing the same thing, they were able to spread, well, not deliberate lies, but oftentimes they were able to spread their thoughts and feelings that were then promoted as fact, that confused a lot of people and eventually caused a lot of misinformation that severely impacted the way in which governments could interact with their people during such a huge healthcare crisis.
Yeah, I completely agree. So it's more people equals more bad people. I'm so sorry, Aditya. I'll take the nudge and then we do have to move on.
So I believe that misinformation becomes an argument based on like how a lot of data is propagated in a lot of news, but it really ends up harming a lot of people just based on like most of the children consuming data via social media and like people of young ages who end up consuming all of this information most of the time. This is generally harmful because a lot of times people, aunties just end up sending out information via Facebook and a lot of people end up believing in it. The
Yeah.
second thing then this becomes about how, a lot of people are harmed by like the kind of data that is outputted. So seeing that it's a black box in the form of data, that means that there are going to be certain biases that have always existed. So maybe, for example, racial stereotyping via social media, just because they prioritize certain things based on whatever happens, but also via like trends whenever. So if people are just like propagating something that's really, really harming certain kind of minority, it's likely that these kind of data are pushed up on your FYP page. This also takes up your data and whatnot because a lot of social media platforms end up taking the amount of time you're using that like the app and like how the amount of times you're using so following certain things and whatnot.
I completely agree. I think these are all probably the claims I would run from opening government. I think the thing that is probably really handy to think about, specifically as we move into closing, is how this impacts individual people. And I think detailed explanations of this are probably a really helpful way to win from closing if you are struggling to come up with things that haven't already been said by your opening in these particular ways as well. Cool. On to back half then. Member of government and member of opposition speeches, specifically running extensions. What is an extension? What does it mean to do so? The role of a member of government or a member of opposition is to meaningfully provide new arguments, new framing, new analysis, new contextualization of the world, and new impacts to the debate from their opening. So if we're taking this social media example, a helpful piece of framing from member of government would be specifically to say, like, for example, oftentimes it is the case that families struggle to regulate how old their child is when they opt into social media. So for example, they might be thinking that their 8-year-old is watching, I don't know, like Coco Melon, but they might accidentally stumble onto TikTok and watch TikToks, which is really bad because they're not of age to do so yet, because it is an app on the phone and because it is so easy. Or like new arguments, which we'll talk about in a second, and then new analysis. And I think the new analysis comes from like, you can do developed analysis on the point made about this being an expectations versus reality disparity, right? So it's specifically just that like influencers want to show the best versions of themselves so they can make money and they can glamorize their lives. And it can also be the case that like you want to make yourself look good, so you feel good about yourself in comparison to other people. That social media propagates a comparison to other people in these things. Given the fact that both opening teams will have been so gracious to take a PY from you, it is your duty to take a PY from them as well. So the member of government from CG takes opening opposition, and the member of opposition takes opening government. I think the important thing to note here, specifically in terms of how judging has changed in the last couple of years, is that you should be differentiating your material as much as you can from your opening. I think what this requires is for you to pay very close attention to what both opening teams are saying and specifically what both speakers are saying. I talked about earlier how there's oftentimes a difference between the intention of an argument and what they are actually saying in the argument. And I think this is specifically how it comes into it. Like, for example, if opening government talks about misinformation and it talks about how people either like get radical or necessarily feel bad because they see radical content, you then ideally don't want to be running an extension that is very similar on the fact that people get particularly emotional when they see these social media posts and stuff, and that makes them feel terrible because it's arguing a very similar point here. So I think differentiating yourself specifically looks like they're talking about radicals and extremes. We're talking about the average kind of situation on social media. So it's a bit different from weighing insofar as you're just clarifying where your extension fits into their extension as opposed to explaining why it's inherently better, which comes afterwards. And I think this is really important as well, because in debates, you will often disagree on what is better for a particular actor. If it is good for an actor to have all of the information about how the world feels about them or less information. So within your extension and within your new analysis, it's probably really recommended to go, this is what opening opposition says against this point. This is why our analysis is better because it doesn't meet XYZ burdens. I think that extension speeches really benefit from running only 1 or 2 new arguments and new and crucial framing. So it's obviously adding rebuttal to the previous speaker if it directly clashes with your material or it stops your material from existing. But I think this is the specific thing you should do here. And I think the realistic way this ends up panning out, specifically for me as well, because I really struggle with closing, is run one argument which fills in the missing analysis that is called out by the other team, or missing analysis that you think is really important to the impact that they're trying to prove. And then run one case that is completely independent from the opening. So for example, for this house believes that social media has done more harm than good, I would posit that there's a really good independent case for the idea that this isolates the younger generation from the older generation. And this is really bad for people's relationships and stuff in the first place. Does that make sense to everyone? I'm just going to read through the chat to see if there's any questions. So all really good points from Aditi, Vinay, and Ashka. Niyati asks, is it essential for the closing team to only use new arguments? Can they not reinstate some major points which are basically acting a backbone for their arguments? I think the problem with that is it is very easy for a judge to call you derivative and give you the fourth. I think what's important on closing is to make sure that all of your material is new and seems new and is obviously new. If you are so scared of it seeming like opening governments run the most important point of the debate, listen to the way that they analyze this, because this is often where the argument falls. Because if it is the case that a team is easily able to rebut this argument, maybe it is the case that while the headline is really important to the debate, they don't actually prove it. Or if they prove it, they don't impact it out greatly. So for example, maybe they give the right analysis on algorithms and misinformation and stuff. But if they don't tell you the impact, that's quite bad because you don't know why it's so important for the debate. Cool. I'll get onto POAs later, Mihit, because I think that's its own separate exercise that I really want to go into. But basically, points of information are literally just questions you asked to the speaker, to a speaker on the opposing bench trying to take down their argument or explain why your argument's better and these kind of things. But I'll go into specific context in a second. Vaishnavi asks, so are we supposed to link back to opening government's case? Yes and no. What you need to do is you need to distinguish yourself from your opening and then explain why you're better. So you are essentially talking about what your opening is saying, but you're making very clear that you are different from them. Cool. Lastly, Tanuj.
What should you do in prep when you're closing? Since if you're in a good room, it's likely that your opening already runs a lot of things that you thought in prep.
Yeah, so there's many things here. I think a lot of mine end up just being like nitty-gritty practical stuff. Like, for example, if I know the team and I know their weaknesses and stuff, probably a really helpful way to do it. Or also just like if I know the judge and I know what kind of arguments they like, this kind of thing. I think if it is the case that you enter a room and you know the speakers are good and you don't know the judge, I think there's several things you need to do. I think firstly, usually in prep time, you do just like in top half, you do just like come up with the argument, write out the speech as accurately as you can. I think in closing, given the fact that you do have like half an hour of extra prep time arbitrarily, I think it is the case that you should come up with 4 or 5 arguments in the first place. And I think it's and I think the arguments that you like that are unlikely to be run on top half are the arguments you should focus on analyzing. And I think the way that you figure out what is likely to be run on top half is if you could come up with the argument in 5 minutes, it's likely that the teams on top half can. If it probably takes you a deeper level of understanding, you should probably be running these arguments. So obviously, given the fact that we literally 2 minutes of prep time were able to come up with the 3 important clashes in debate, probably mean that the surface level arguments will be taken, but specific things like the deeper impact on personal relationships in real life, the deeper impacts on how your political standings change, and the deeper impacts specifically in terms of how you feel about yourself and insecurity are still things that are remaining at the end of it. If nothing else, I think there's 2 strategies I like to do when I'm really desperate for an extension, which is 1, to run why this hurts the most vulnerable actors in the debate or minorities and stuff, casually known as a minorities extension. Or secondly, just explaining, just doing a lot of framing. So for example, like if it is the case that opening government runs that like social media does more harm than good because there's a lot of misinformation, do the analysis to explain why it is the case that social media does this so badly, which is one way you're able to explain our analysis comes first to opening government and you rely on us to credit that argument. So like, and specifically here, it's just that like there's so many uses to moderate and there's so many different ways in which a thing could be interpreted as hate speech or free speech. So it's very subjective and there's a very limited capacity you have to do this, if that makes sense. Cool. Is that okay with everyone? I'm going to move on to structure because I think this will probably clear up a lot of questions. And then I'll take some more on extension specifically. Cool. This is how you do extension speeches in the most clear way to make your argument the newest. The first thing you do is responses to the previous speaker. Oftentimes you can make this very concise because usually it is the case that a lot of your extension would end up being in response to another team in the first place, or it will be competing analysis that clashes on a certain point. So if CG and O really care about the spread of information, then your case in and of itself will clash with this. So the responses should be to specific bits of framing or specific impacts they claim they are getting that don't fit this, that are just outside of the clash. Just in the case that the judge credits this as not being responded to. And then you do this thing called positioning, which I think is probably the most important part of an extension. What is missing from my opening team's arguments? How am I going to fill these burdens? I think the specific advice I have that makes positioning quite easy and makes yourself believe in the extension more is when you're tracking your opening, try and broadly firstly write out what they're saying, but secondly, write out why it doesn't work. Write it out as if you're going to respond to it from opening opposition, for example. Like, but not in terms of rebutting your opening, but in terms of what burdens they still need to prove to make this argument true. And I think these are other pathways you get to having new content, which ultimately don't rely on your, which can also be seen as independent from your opening and can be seen as needed for your openings cases to work. So positioning is basically just finding flaws and finding things that are unclear in your opening and explaining them and explaining why your new extension is like answers a fundamental question that top half struggles to get right, for example. So I think that given that extensions come down to ultimately selling yourself, the specific way you end up doing this is just opening government says XYZ reasons why misinformation is bad. Opening opposition says XYZ reasons why you get a rise of good information. No team is able to conclusively prove that the rise causes these, and no team is able to conclusively prove that you get access to more misinformation than good information. These are the two burdens we're going to prove in closing government. That's an example of how I do positioning. It's just finding flaws, finding responses that opening government isn't able to sufficiently respond to, and exploiting them to your benefit. Then you do this like basic argument structure that I talked about. I think the important thing to note within this is if you have analysis that is clashing with other teams, it is important to say why your clashing analysis is better within the argument itself. And I think this makes it really helpful in the first place. And then you just do the why is this true? Why is this important? Why is this more true and more important than anything else or competing analysis in the debate as well? Like I said, you are selling yourself. So you really have to believe in the extension. I think that the way to believe in your extension is to really scrutinize your opening and really listen to responses that your opening is vulnerable to and make sure that your cases are either able to sidestep these responses or respond to these responses better. Because I'll note a really good way to just weigh over your opening and closing is just level of responsiveness. It's very hard in deputies, truth be told, to respond to every response a team is given or respond to every single line of a case that a team is given. And maybe it is the case that with the limited time you have on deputy, you miss the intention of a particular response, or you miss the way in which a particular response engaged with the case. And these are just all many ways you can just exploit and make your opening look worse than you. Cool. Lastly, on whip speeches, which I think is pretty straightforward given everything we've done. So I'm just going to look through the chat for questions now. Can everyone see my screen? Can I just confirm this? So I'm doing that, and then I'm looking at the chat now for questions. Love. Okay. What should be the main focus of closing half? Should they be more focused towards rebutting and pointing out flaws in the opposition, or should they be more focused on introducing and explaining new points and filling in the gaps of the opening? So it's both. I think the rebutting thing applies specifically to whip, but I think doing some rebuttal at the top of your member speeches is important in making your contribution seem more favorable, more good to the judges. So I just think on vibes, if you're able to make your extension look smart and good and needed for the debate, judges will view the analysis favorably. But at the end of the day, the points have to be new and the points have to be important. That is what you should be seeing at the crux of it all. Kashni, can you see the screen now? If not, then yeah, I would rejoin back. Cool, awesome. Love, whip speeches. Whip speeches have the duty of responding to every single team in the debate. You've heard 3 teams. You are now able to fully prove why you were able to beat 2 teams, all 3 teams, even in the debate. And this is where strategy really matters. If you know your opening is amazing, there's probably ways you can respond to your other bench in a way in which secures you the second. Or if your CO or your O is really good, you can just wash out a lot of things that are happening in opening government or closing opposition. And I think whip speeches uniquely give you the power to do so because you're one of the last speakers to do, one of the last speakers to speak in the debate. So your conception of the debate really matters in this particular way. And I think it is for this specific reason, and for the specific reason that there was so much detail in my structure for how you should respond to teams, that you should only really be doing this. It is already in the rulebook that you can't introduce new arguments, but you can make new framing, new analysis, and new responses. I would posit you should definitely just integrate this into your engagement with teams, though. I don't think you should be running this as your own independent content. I think even teams at the top that try and do this really struggle with judges that care about engagement. And I think given that we're shifting towards a meta of good rebuttal now, I just think you should prioritize this substantially more. The structure is just simple, and I'll go into detail on this in the next slide. You respond to the team previously, you weigh over your opening, and then you respond to the team on the diagonal. It's important for me to respond to the team on the diagonal, by the way, leaving enough time to do so, because when you ask the POI to diagonal, it is likely that the POI that they ask is probably going to be the parts of their case they care the most about. So if you can tackle those and then tackle the things they don't necessarily prioritize, you can just feel confident in your ability to take down a case and make the judge confident that you've taken down that case in the first place as well. We did rebuilding in deputies. You should also be rebuilding when you're weighing over your opening. But I think these two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. I think you can just explain why your material is good against another team while also explaining why it is better than what your opening would say on this particular thing. And as I said, you should take a POI from the diagonal in the first place. That's the structure then. It's this, I'll note this is the exact same structure as the rebuttal placed in both deputies. And then the new thing here is, I guess, how to weigh. You can weigh of scale of impact, intensity of impact, logical priority, i.e. our analysis is needed for their analysis to be true. The certainty of impact, i.e. like it's speculative, who interprets what from a particular piece of social media. And then time frame. Our impacts are long-term. Our impacts respond to an urgent crisis now. This is really, really good. I think if you're struggling, go for level of responsiveness, because I just think this is probably the way to do so. Level of responsiveness, intensity of impact, and logical priority are probably the easiest low-hanging fruit you can kind of grab from this. I think there's some obvious impacts that stem from this debate that if your opening teams are ambitious, they won't run, and these particular things in the first place. I know some high quality rooms love to weigh on like depth of analysis or directness to the motion. I, as someone who's judged a lot, I generally don't know what these mean. And I think if you can't be clear on that, there are other ways of showing that your analysis is better. And there are other ways of showing that you're more inherent to the motion, specifically in terms of the exclusivity of your claims, which is another way you can weigh. Cool. Really quickly making good POIs, and then I'll stay 5 minutes longer to do questions. A POI, or a point of information, is a 15-second statement with the aim of attacking the truth, logic, context, exclusivity, importance of an argument with the intention of making that argument seem unpersuasive. That's just the broad definition of what a POI is. Advice on how to make good POIs. It should be written down, clear, rhetorical, and no longer than 15 seconds. The shorter the better, because you are, as the speaker, allowed to cut off the POI, and you don't want it to be cut off before you are trying to make the main point you're trying to make. I think POIs should be specifically, like, the way to make them clear and the way to make them rhetorical is probably just through examples and intuition vibes. Like, if you support this, would you also support XYZ? Given that X is true, surely ABC is also true, and ABC being a particularly bad thing. And I think it's what you're trying to do here is question the extent to where the logic starts and stops of your particular team if you can't prove that it's distrue, untrue in 15 seconds. And then my favorite style as a POI is that if it is true that X happens, why is it the case that Y does or doesn't happen? Like challenging the exclusivity. Like, because realistically, I think on both sides of the house, bad actors exist. I don't think they become particularly more intense. And presumably the rise of social media means that you have a better capacity to insulate against these because you have more funding. Or like the typical, if it's as deep as you describe, presumably it would be deep on both sides of the house, kinds of things are probably really good as well. And I think the bottom line of POIs is, I think you want to make your case seem reasonable, seem unresponded to, or seem the most exclusive in the debate. And I think these are probably the easiest ways to wash out extensions, or the easiest ways in which to make the comparison on the diagonals particularly challenging for the judges to credit the closing team over you. Or vice versa, if you're the closing team, I think there are very easy ways for you to regain autonomy in these particular situations by just claiming that they don't prove the extent to which it happens on their side and calling out the lack of positive material on their side of the house. Cool. Are there any questions? I've got 4 messages on the chat. What if my motion is opposition-sided and I'm the government? How do I exactly tackle a motion like that? I think that the caveat to this is I don't think that this particularly happens often, specifically because for other styles, I think it's literally all you have to test balance. If your CAs are bad, that it's obviously outweighed, there's no government cases, that's a really bad thing. In instances where you feel like it's upweighted, for example, I'd like to do a few things. The first is to really cast doubt on the obvious opposition case. And what I mean by that is maybe there's a really intuitive push here. So for example, if the motion, to make this motion upweighted, if it was this house prefers a world without social media, it's quite obviously upweighted because op will say social media creates communities and friends for people that don't have access to them. I think there are many ways you can challenge the persuasiveness of this claim. And I think this just comes down to how you sell yourself and how you believe in yourself. So if you go into prep time saying, oh, this is upweighted, this is obviously going to reflect in your speeches and the extent to which you believe in yourself. But I think just on the empirics and on the structurals, just push, if you think the burden on government is unreasonable, push really strong burdens on op to prove their case. And specifically be really nitty-gritty about the analysis that they have in these particular cases as well. And I think what this is able to do is it is able to show that there is a reasonable world in which your case takes place and an unreasonable world in which their case takes place as well. I also just like to, in these kind of motions, do really heartstringy, like really emotional examples and illustrations to show my impacts. And I think this is the way to get a judge for fight for you, because if you can appeal to their heart, even in the most upweighted motions, you can at least beat one team or wash out your closing or beat the team on top half, for example, in these particular ways. But yeah, are POIs included in the time of speech? Yes, they are. You have a duty to shut them down if you think they're rambling on. Do individuals belong to specific teams, such as their opening or closing teams? Are there inherent qualities that differentiate people, allowing them to be placed in different groups? Yes. So you're randomly allocated based on the draw. You come into a competition with a partner. You will do one position each of OG, OO, CG, CO. If there's a round 5, you're randomly allocated one of these positions. And if you break, then you get randomly allocated OG, OO, CG, CO in the rounds as well. When exactly should one address a POI? Should a team address a POI in the same speech, or should the latest speaker do so? It is completely up to you. If you immediately understand what the POI is getting at, nip it in the bud, shut it down, and give it a good response. If you're not sure, just say your partner will answer it. This is also completely fine as well. And this probably is strategically good because it gives you a chance to think about why they would have said the particular thing they claimed. If you could please go 2 slides back just for a second, if possible. Yeah, of course. Cool. Is it GovWhip and OpWhip structure, I'm assuming? Yeah. So is the POI the main point of the argument? It can be, to be clear. A POI is a question you're making to another team. So you can reiterate your point, but it is just about attacking their point. Like the specific idea behind this is that if you're opening government and your closing opposition makes really good points, obviously you don't have a speech to give for rebuttal. So you have a 15-second window in which to summarize your best rebuttal or your best attack to this case, so that closing opposition has a way to engage with you and you have a way to engage with them, if that makes sense. But yeah. Cool. I'll wait like a minute for questions and then sum up on my thoughts on how to come up with good arguments, because I think that's something that could be its own masterclass in and of itself. Cool. By the way, if people can't see the chat or raise their hands, feel free to shout out now as well. Cool. Seeing nothing, I'm just going to conclude with some general advice about making arguments and making good arguments and believing in yourself to win debates. I think with this activity, it is about the effort you put in is the effort you get out of it. So what I mean by that is, if you want to come up with smart cases on the political and economic state of the world, it's probably good to research the political and economic state of the world. Sorry, a fire alarm's going off. Specifically things like reading The Economist or the World Trade Organization webpage, or the Wall Street Journal if you're so advanced. Obviously, I appreciate that you guys are kids, but I think if you want to make these kind of novel arguments and if you want to have a truth understanding of the world, then this is the kind of the way in which you do it. I also just recommend checking out like Debating Series posting and kind of these Facebook resources that a lot of people have for stock arguments and motions that come up commonly. So you can come up with and reiterate common arguments in your prep times as well. Because I think that prep times struggle when everything you are saying has to be new. I think a lot of times it's hard to be original in debates and hard to come up with a completely original debate motions. It's probably just a chance that has been set before in some capacity. So if you can reiterate some of the analysis, or you can reiterate the case, that's really good. And then you give yourself time to come up with what will the other teams say? How do I position this extension to win the debate, and these kind of things as well. Yeah, Niyati?
I had a question. So, what would you say is the best way to connect your points with other comparisons?
Yeah, of course. So I always like to spend 2 minutes in prep time just coming up with what the comparative is and how op teams will frame the comparative. You're also just very welcome to be clear on what the comparative is in your own arguments, which is to say, you can say, look, from opening opposition, look, social media is imperfect, but it's very hard to find avenues for the kinds of vulnerable people to get communities in the first place. So we would rather this imperfect system than general society where people are awful to your face, it's hard to gauge social interactions, it's inaccessible for a lot of people, this kind of thing. So you can do it in your own speeches. You should be talking about it in prep time. And if you're unsure, you can just ask for POIs, even from your opening on this particular metric as well. And I think the thing to call out probably here as well is if they don't make a comparative, call out the fact that they're not making a comparative as well, so that this probably just bolsters the extent to which your comparative is given. And also just a note on comparatives and framing. These are still points of analysis. Please just justify why they're true in and of their own rights as well. Does that answer your question? Cute, love. I'll take one more and then I'll let Kamal from Indian Debating League take any questions and pass them on. But other than that, thank you very much for having me. I really do appreciate this. And I really love coming back to the Asian circuit because I judge a lot in the summer and I honestly saw some really great debates and some really talented potential from a lot of teams. I look forward to meeting you maybe virtually at a comp in the future. But as I said, if you have any questions or you want the slides, feel free to reach out to Indian Debating Group because they will have all this information. Thank you very much and have a good evening.